Now that the 2019 legislative session is over, I wanted to provide a brief recap of where everything stands. First, our priority legislation. Called the Pre-Need Trust Disclosure Act and initiated by the New York State Funeral Directors Association, this initiative would simply establish a set of best financial practices for all pre-need administrators that are the depositories for funds prepaid by consumers, by your families, to cover their funeral and burial expenses when they pass away. Our legislation was sponsored in the Senate by Leroy Comrie of Queens and Dick Godfrey, the Assembly Health Chairman in the State Assembly. It passed the Senate on June 6th and then the Assembly on June 19th, unanimously in both houses. This legislation would require a pre-need administrator to conduct an annual audit by a certified public accountant of all its pre-need accounts and stipulate what the audit must include. That accrual and monthly posting of all consumer accounts must take place. That the administrator must retain copies of all pre-need contracts, death certificates, checks, or other forms of payment for 4 years after the final payment is made, and have their assets valued and presented in accordance with GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles. In essence, all this information would enable a funeral director and his or her family to make more informed decisions about just how a depository of any kind, including a trust, is handling their family's pre-need monies by shining a light on their financial practices. The more information that is disclosed, the more a funeral home can take confidence and comfort, knowing just how these pre-need funds are being managed by that depository. Finally, the legislation would allow a funeral director to accept no more than 25 basis points of the currently authorized 75 basis points of that fee for administrative services that a funeral director provides. What are those services? Well, the many hours a licensed funeral director spends working closely with each person to prearrange the details of his or her funeral and burial, and or establish a pre-need contract required by law if a person chooses to prepay their funeral and burial expenses in advance. Notably, our bill also had the support of the New York Statewide Senior Action Council, one of the preeminent senior groups in this state. And their support is based on the guiding principle that all pre-need administrators holding pre-need funds meet and adhere to the same standards of scrutiny, accountability, and transparency for the benefit of those New York State consumers who choose to prepay their funeral and burial costs. As I mentioned earlier, our bill passed both houses of the legislature and unanimously, and so we are much closer to making this happen. But our work is not yet done. In the near future, this bill will be sent to Governor Cuomo for his review, and his signature is needed for our initiative to become law. Getting this bill passed the legislature was not an easy feat and required many meetings in Albany, meetings throughout the state that included funeral directors and their local senators and assembly representatives, and of course, the active engagement of our members who, when receiving our calls to action, contacted their legislators to urge support for our bill. Our members responded without fail and at very critical times in this process where delay or inaction could have made the difference between success or failure. So to all of our member funeral directors and those in the ranks of legislative liaisons who serve to advance our cause to advocate for this bill, a sincere thank you from myself and Government Relations Assistant Scott Henderson. You made a world of difference. Now, having said that, our success also means that no legislation targeting funeral service that would have affected us in a negative way was passed. What that means is we were able to keep at bay legislation that, for instance, would have allowed a process called alkaline hydrolysis, but only for cemeteries, excluding funeral homes from offering that to families. There was also a bill that would have weakened the final disposition law, a law that's used routinely throughout the state by funeral directors when working with their families to make prearrangements and ensure who the person is in control of the final disposition. And finally, many proposals were introduced, all well-meaning, to address the shortcomings of stretch limousines after the horrific crash in Schoharie County this past fall. We wanted to make sure, though, that that legislation did not inadvertently, unintendedly, sweep funeral service into its sights. We wanted to make sure that your liveries and the services you provide to families were not brought into its scope and thereby kept free of additional regulation that will be provided to all other limo operators in this state. Once again, thank you all for your attention, for your interest, and your active involvement.